up your book of great sporting moments. England Roses, they just rewrote history again.
This new era Netball Super League has had it all.
That is what it means. This place, this time, this team. London Pulse are crowned Netball Super League champions 2025.
Welcome to this week's Off the Court. I'm Tamsin Greenway, head coach at London Mavericks, and joining me every week, co-host Tracey Neville, CEO of Stockport County women's team, and of course the ex-England Roses coach. Tracey, we're halfway through this season, and this weekend there were wins for Loughborough Pulse and Thunder in the derby, and Birmingham Panthers got their first win of the season as well in an absolute thriller, 1 goal against LexisNexis Dragons. We're starting to see a bit of a pattern here. The top 3 front runners, you've got Loughborough, you've got Pulse, you've got Thunder breaking away. There's that middle pack of my team Mavericks, of Forest and of Dragons. And you're seeing a similar pattern in the SSN as well with the games over there. This weekend there were wins for T-Birds, Fever, Vixens, and Mavericks got that win to push them into the top 4. But again, another 3 front runners there with sort of Mavericks and Sunshine Coast Lightning, maybe Swifts if they have a big turnaround. Getting into that top 4. And of course, we saw some injury woes and more trauma really for England with Helen Housby in a very loose statement about when she's going to be back, which was quite scary to read. And of course, Alice Harvey, goalkeeper at Loughborough Lightning, who I think's been having an outstanding season so far. And with the injury to Jazz Brown getting her out for Commonwealth Games, was probably a front runner to step in there as well. So much happened in a weekend of netball. I know you've been away. Did you get to catch up on that? Was there anything that stood out for you?
Do you know what? I think it was the underdog teams for me at weekend. If you saw Giants, they were leading all the way against Adelaide Thunderbirds in the SSN, and then for Birmingham Panthers to get the first win. And I think we have to celebrate Sophie Egberron. My first exposure to her was at the World Youth. And would you believe I went to the World Youth and I knew all the Australian players. And Charlotte Sexton actually got a debut this weekend, who was obviously in that competition. But I didn't actually know any of the England players. I only knew Pekova, and that was the only player. So for me, when I saw Sophie Egberron, the actual whole team revolved around her, I thought, at World Youth. It felt the whole attack line, either whether she was in goal shooter or goal attack. So I think for me, when I saw her play for Birmingham Panthers at the weekend, I was like, why has this kid not been signed? Because, I reflect back to my World Youth or World Youth, them kids who normally come out of that competition are generally first on the team sheet for anyone. So for me, she offers such, she's hard to mark. She was unorthodox. And Tamsin, you talk about that experience being youth, and I feel that's where the mix of teams need to be. When I saw her play, she had nothing to lose. She weren't scared. And do you know what I saw? I saw a shooter that was hungry for post. And yeah, she missed a few clutch shots or she missed a few here. But she was willing to take it on. It didn't scare her. She carried on. And, I think the celebration around that, I think that's what Birmingham Panther needed. So I don't know, I thought she was from Leeds, me. So when I look at some of the Leeds shooters, I'm like, I was told she was from Leeds. I might have got that wrong. But when I saw her come in that dress, I thought, do you know what? She's one for the future, 100%.
Well, you say it was a round of the underdogs, and just some context for that, Giants getting within 2 at Adelaide Thunderbirds, which was top versus bottom. And it was sort of a surprise result. If you saw the Dragons team at the end of the game, they were gutted after losing that 1 goal thriller to Panthers. And they were bottom, with the Dragons pushing for a top 4 place and playing very well up till that point. You mentioned Sophie Egberron, and she was definitely star of the round, right? She was absolutely phenomenal. And again, brought in for an injury replacement, stepped up from that Birmingham Panthers next gen under Sonia McCloma, who took her to the under-21s. And it's interesting to talk about that because I was assistant coach at the 21s. And Soph and Hannah Knightbridge were the only 2 players that didn't get a full contract at the start of the season this year. So all the other players, your Jadas, your Izzy Kays, your Alana Pullins, your Anya Williams, they're all in. Actually, Hannah Gibson, tell a lie, she was there as well. Now, Hannah Knightbridge has been brought into our London Mavericks squad and has pretty much played out the whole season with the injury to Ellie Ratu. So if Egberron has played Super League before, she was at Leeds. She's actually from down south. She's further down. She actually came back to Loughborough Lightning from Loughborough Uni to play for London Mavericks when we needed an injury replacement a couple of seasons ago. She had that season at Leeds Rhinos. They didn't keep her. They kept Harriet Jones. They brought in Paige Reed for some experience. Now, Soph, when I went into the 21 squad, it was really interesting. And I love the opportunity, right? Because Sonia McClellan brought me in and said, I want you to work with the shooters. And her and Lauren Palmer had done such a good job with this group. There wasn't really a target shooter. So if you look at the shooters in there at the minute, you had an Anya Williams, you had a Soph Kelly, you had a Soph Egburn, and you had a Hannah Gibson. So you're looking at those. Freya Henshaw was your training partner. She was more of a target shooter. So you had this rotating circle, and that wasn't my strength. I've not worked with really a rotating circle before. So I loved the challenge. Sonia was like, let loose with it, decide what you want to do with it. She obviously inputted and said what she wanted, but it was really nice to be able to work with that. And Soph was untouchable on her movement, and it's really interesting you talked about that. And this is the thing about the fearless young player as well, right? She everything I gave her, she just took on, and no one could take ball off her. No one could. She reminded me of a young Amal Boise. Like, Amal Boise started in the shooting end when I was at Bath. Actually, I was at England and I played my first caps with her.
Yeah.
But Amal was unpredictable at the post. Now, I think Soph's got it under the post, and working with her mindset, like, she's so driven. I mean, an absolute star for the future, and almost that, like, light up that Birmingham Panthers needed to get them over the line. And this is the toy with the young players, right? We've discussed it a little bit before, but you've got to give opportunity for young players, and Birmingham Panthers at this point have nothing to lose. So why not sprinkle that bit of magic and see what happens? And she stepped up and delivered.
Do you know what's fascinating for me? It's the learning I saw in her. And like, I don't know this girl's history at all, so I'm talking from an absolute novice in this. But in that last part of the game, she was doing like a Tiana Matoru. So she's obviously been like watching Super League. You can tell she's been watching. She's obviously been watching SSM, because in that dying second, she was one of them like players who was out deep in the goal third. So she wasn't in the circle, just playing it around with a wing attack. She was taking ball so that they won. They won within 1 point. And I was thinking, that is really, really smart. And that's not coached, a lot of that. That you could tell it's not coached. It was like a first exposure in a full game. And I don't know her. I apologise if she said if it's been coached, but I don't know her. I just saw something about a young player who's been watching netball, has been watching the smartness around the super shot, and she did it right. And sometimes that's what a team needs. I know we go for experience, and you can't get away from experience, but I just saw something in her that sometimes every team needs, and it reflects back to like Nat Metcalf against Jamaica, back at the Commonwealth Games. I threw her on. She had no previous experience of playing a bronze medal match. A semi-final match. She had no previous experience. She'd played Jamaica before, but she just went for it. And that freedom is really, really hard to find in players. And I think sometimes we can coach that out of them, the fear. But she had no fear. And so shout out to Sophie. I thought you were class at weekend, mate.
Hey, there you go. Sophie, I'm sure you're listening. I'm sure you're absolutely listening if you are. Well, she knows how brilliant I think she is, and an absolute star for the future as well. And like you say, there's certain things in people like little winners. And actually, Hannah Knightbridge for us has been very similar in terms of the game sense. And I love that in players. And Nat Metcalf was why I wanted my hands on her back in the day. I loved working with her because she was fearless. And you knew in those big moments she was going to stand up and deliver. And she did that for England as well.
And Tamsin, if she plays consistently now, Sophie, because I'm unsure how long Tiana Matoru's out, but if she plays now, she's going to get a little bit found out over the next few weeks. But she needs to get found out to learn and develop. But I still feel she's got something that, that nobody can take out of her. I think she's still got that hunger, and that you don't really see. And, you saw Lois Pearson, she's one of our hungry players, isn't she, for England at the moment. And you see her doing it on the international stage. But I think that is definitely one for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think she's a little star in the making. So there you go. Big shout out to her. So you can talk about the unseen, like the game sense and stuff, but we wanted to hit some stats now we're halfway through the season, which is my favourite thing to do. My analyst loves me because she collects everything, all the data for me. I obviously watch a hell of a lot and take things down as well. Now, we actually posed the question on social about the stats this week, and we asked, what is the most important stat at the moment? The 1-point shot, the 2-point shot, the turnover, and the errors. The first question I'm going to ask Tracey is, what is your most important out of those?
Do you know, it was at England International, it was turnovers, because in our what it takes to win, it was if you converted more of your turnovers than the other team, you were guaranteed to win. In SSN, it was definitely errors. Team it was definitely errors.
Oh yeah.
When I look, was looking my hairs up today. I'll be ripping my hair out. But it's the first thing we used to talk about, and it's the silly errors as well. And probably can talk a lot about from the weekend. But just the silly errors, call them silly errors. But yeah, because we used to be aiming the best teams.
I bet you didn't call them silly errors. I bet you did not call them silly errors in training. I bet there was another word for that.
I always remember Richo used to ring me up, and she used to say, and she used to just go, miss shot, drop ball, handling error, footwork, offside. She said, how can we coach that? And it's the typical, isn't it? And do you know what? If we'd have converted that, guess what, Tamsin? You would have won.
Won the game. I know,
that, isn't it? You're like, yeah, oh God.
I was literally caught in the changing room this weekend, going through the errors after the game, booting the physio bag. And my performance staff were like that. And they were like, what was that one? I was like, offside. I was like, why?
I know. And do you know what? You always say, if we hadn't have done them, we'd have won the game. And you'd like,
easy.
Easy. If I was Catherine, I'd be Princess of England now.
And there we go. We've got a little bit off. So turnovers at England, because it was so important, because I think because at international level the margins are so small. There's also no super shot, so your turnovers are massive. And also when we talked about this earlier in some of the previous series, like when you're playing international series where teams are making between 15 and 17 errors a game, like your turnover is huge. You get a player that can win the big ball in the big moments, that's going to be massive for you. But it's also what you do with it. You can have a team that can win loads of ball. If you can't convert it, that's a different story as well. Errors, I agree. And like, especially with the 2-point shot now, errors are massive. And it's not just the error or the nature of the error, it's the timing of when you do it. So 41% agreed with you, Tracey, on the turnover, 39% thought errors. Interestingly, only 12% on the 1-point and 8% on the 2-point. And I wanted to talk today about how crucial those areas of the game are. And that's where we're going to start with the 1-point zone. And I think you mentioned it a few weeks ago when we were talking about the super shot. You still play 40 minutes of the game in 1-point time. So the super shot is important, but there's still a huge amount of the game where you have to convert your 1 points and you have to be dominant in that area.
Tamsin, I just reflect back to what you've just said in respect to where the game's going and, the conversion. So I'll give you, when I went into England as head coach, I was sat down and obviously everything was handed over to me. And I remember looking and there was this document, right? And it just was full of stats. It was the most mind-blowing document. It looked like I'd robbed a maths shop. Honestly, there was just figures and things. And I remember saying to Colette Thompson at the time, and I said, just give me the stats that means I win a game, right? That was the stat. Just simplify it for me. Like, it's not like obviously maths background, but I was like, just simplify it. What wins me the game? And she come up with, and do you know what the scary thing for me at the time was, Tamsin, was at the time it was if we got over 70% success to goal, we won a game. If we converted more of our turnovers, and it wasn't a stat on that, it was just we converted the turnovers, we won a game. And we had to keep the opposition to less than 70%. Then with the margins, I get out to SSN, right? And the conversion to goal is something like 8 to 9. So West Coast Fever, their average, and I'm going to ping this out, was about 86% to goal. And most of that was in the 1 point time. So you're talking about the 1 point shot. So, error rate was so vital out there because their conversion was so high. And I actually remember sitting there going to Rich on going, at International in 2018, we knew we would win this Commonwealth Games if we got over 70% success to goal, which we did. And we won the game against Australia. So you're going up to 86% now. So the importance of that 1 point game is vital.
Yeah, absolutely huge. And teams need to be hitting pretty much around the 40 mark. So you want to be hitting 10 1-pointers a game. That would be a rough kind of look at what you're doing. So you need some kind of target in there, which is great if you've got a target shooter. If you're playing a rotating, it puts a huge amount of pressures. Now, do you know the team that has the most amount of 1-point attempts in the Super League at the minute?
It's generally the team that's at the top of the table. I don't know if that's true.
Well, interestingly, Thunder above them. Thunder have more 1-point attempts on average across. That was the first round, 6 rounds.
Okay.
But Loughborough right up there, and Loughborough's conversion is better. So Loughborough are huge. And where Loughborough double up is they're so dominant in the 2-point zone as well. So they have the double whammy of consistency. But interestingly, and this is why it is so important, when they played, why you have the consistency of both, which is why it was so key when people are going, the 2-point makes no difference. I'm going to fudge that totally. When London Pools played Loughborough Lightning, and you can go and look at these stats on the website, London Pools had 37 1-points. Loughborough Lightning had 32 1-points. Loughborough Lightning won that game because they had 18 Amex super shots. So, I mean, it's absolutely huge. And if you look at games this weekend, you only have to go and look at the website to look at the game. Our London Mavericks game versus London Pools and Leeds Rhinos, actually, interestingly, this weekend against Thunder, how low the 1-point zone was and how they survived and the games didn't become blowouts because of the 2-point shot. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Now, you can't survive on the 2 points, but if you use it effectively, wow, it's invaluable. And especially in our league where the percentages are so high, because you've talked on and on every single week about no one's defending the super shot, and it absolutely matters, right?
But there's a fear around it, isn't there? Because we used to talk about the 1-point zone out at Melbourne Mavericks, and we had obviously Shimona Nelson in that shooting circle at the time, and we used to talk on, and it was interesting what I saw at weekend as well, Tamsin, just comparing them to things, and for me, I look at it like everyone was like, oh, you shouldn't have done this, or you all have an opinion sat there. But I look at it from a coach's point of view, and I think I reflect on it a little bit differently. So there were 2 situations for me. London Mavericks went 12-1 down, and then Celtic Dragons went 10-0 down, but there wasn't a change in the shooting circle. Now, I look at this from a coaching point of view, and I reflect on that, and I look at it from a positive and a negative, because we can't as coaches just go, we can just put a plaster over it. And I've been in many international teams where they've changed the defence to change something because the shooting circle. One, as a coach, you've got to have the change. You've got to have the change. The second thing, so you've got to have someone on your bench that you can change and will make impact in that position. The second thing for me as a coach is that I look at it and think, if I make that change, what does that do to my attack? So the problem sometimes is not in the shooting change, it's in actually. So I look at that situation where you had Yarrington and Neve McCall, to
playing the Dragons,
that shooting lineup, we would have had to move Neve McCall out and then obviously put Georgia on, which happened later on, In your lineup, to put Amelia on, we'd have had to move Emma Thacker away from the line. And sometimes we have to think about the whole picture when we're coaching a team. Now, as the game went on, and I know you did an interview, and I didn't see Rienga's interview, but in the last quarter, there was a change where in the third quarter in the London Mavericks game, you went 4 down, and Celtic Dragons made the change of Georgia Rowe, and they started to obviously to come back at Birmingham Panthers. Now, I've been in a similar situation when I've been out at Melbourne Mavericks with a 1-point shooter, and there's more, and we reflect back on the blueprint. The player is just not the player in the game. The player is part of the blueprint, and they offer something within that blueprint. So that's whether, with Shimona, we had to bring her off if she was shooting less than probably 30 goals at the post, because she doesn't really contribute anything out in play. So she doesn't contribute to anything to do with that centre pass apart from the feed in. So if we can't feed in, she's not contributing. Plus, if she's doing a few errors, that comes off. So I look at things a little bit differently within that, and the error rates that come in. And I think that's something that we don't look at from a fan point of view. We just look at what changes we're meant to make. You've seen coaches play it in different ways. So, I talk about Adelaide Thunderbirds, but, you talked about Swifts who've done it for years with Helen Housby and Sophie Fawns. You looked at Jez Murphy, playing his card with Unique Pallavi early in respect of coming into the 2-point time. The only team really that doesn't really change is Vixens, and West Coast Fever don't tend to change, even though they brought Olivia Wilkinson on. So you're seeing teams making different decisions, coaches making decisions. Now sometimes it pays off for you. For them 2 teams at weekend, for London Mavericks and for Celtic Dragons, it didn't pay off. It got them back in the game, but it didn't actually pay off. But I think it's when you make that change, and it's a minute change, but there's a lot of more things we have to take in.
I'll speak for it from a London Mavericks point of view. We've been averaging 43 1-points a game, and it was no surprise we didn't get anywhere near that against London Pulse. We struggled. We were on 18 1-points. That's never going to win you. It's never going to win you a game, right? So you have to look at those things. Now the 2-point game got us back into the game, and Amelia Hall and Emma Thacker did that for us. But that's not sustainable, and I think that's what people need to understand. If you're having to win the game on the 2-pointers alone, that's a problem. If it's a sprinkling of magic, it's not a problem. If it's to win the game, it's an issue. So that's your first thing. You've also got the injury issue. We didn't have Emily Andrew available, for example. So we didn't have another target shooter. And exactly what you said, taking Emma Thacker out of her bread and butter and putting her back solves one sort of issue, but doesn't solve every issue. So you're banking on that as well. So you've got those things to consider. You've then got the nature of the error. So it was really interesting. Most teams, if they go 6 or 7 down in the first few minutes, you have to decide, are you going to call the timeout early? Because once you've called it, that's all you've got. We don't have 2 timeouts here. So once you've called that, and we sat there at about 8-1, and I was like, I'll give them one more, and they did, and we actually asked, and it didn't get done until the next set. So whatever, we were 12-1 down when we called it. Now, when the game unravels and you play out, there's so many other things about it. The changes other teams make that help you get back in the game as well. Like, I'm not naive to that. And you only have to look across the league this season and the fixtures this round to see some of the changes that helped. Loughborough Lightning, for example, were 12 up going into a super shot period and ended up only going 4 in. And there were some key changes that were made in that attack end. Now, I'm not saying that's anybody's fault. It's never someone's fault. I'm just saying it all has impact. And as a coach, you never know how people are going to respond. Now, in hindsight, it's easy. I got asked a very interesting question at the end of my interview about why did I change the shooting circle that got us back in the game. And my point was, we hadn't scored enough 1-pointers in there, and that shooting circle didn't give us enough 1-points. And if anyone goes back, we lost the first 3 centre passes of that 4th quarter. And so I had to roll the dice again. And it worked for a short period of time. It didn't work for the long period, and that's what happened. But like you said, and it's not a right or wrong. You're never right or wrong. It's just the game. You have to make decisions based on so many other things, on momentum and game changes, what you know about your players, the injuries, the unit, but also the stats that are presented in front of you, because they do matter. They absolutely matter. And when you're desperately trying to find a way, it can't just be rip up the playbook and start again. It's actually, why are we making these errors? What do I think I can fix with this unit? Who do you think will impact? And for how long that impact will work as well. And that's why it's a really interesting job.
I always remember Marion Lofthouse. I went to the under-19s in my first ever competition when I was young. It was one of my first coaching roles for YWCA. We went to this competition and she actually said some really good advice. This is where you didn't have access to stats, or you didn't have, you don't have the information you have now. You don't have the support structure. I just remember sat on the sideline and we had Natalie Woolley out at goal attack. And I actually said, we were losing. And I was like, I was like irrational. I was emotional. And she actually just said, just stop. And she said, take the emotion out of this. Take the emotion out of this. Do not look at your starting 7. Look at, what does this game need? And I said, we just need some stability at the back. And she said, well, what is that stability? And I said, it's basically to move Natalie Woolley back to goal shooter. We just need someone in the circle who's just static, who can take the ball tall and just shoot the goal. And she went, well, take the emotion out and look at what the game needs. And you know what? I always go back to that now. I always go back. And so when I listen to coaches, it's if you start to get emotional as a coach, and I'm not talking about passion or that's like inbred in you, I'm talking about, what does this actual game need? And it's really hard because the game now is so fast. There's so much happening. And you always have that thing in your head about... Yeah, you always have that thing in your head, and I look at it now, and, I look at Maseko playing goal shooter and absolute... Do you know what, Tamsin? I'm going to say who we're going to champion this week, because we championed Maseko, we championed Nat Metcalf, and they both had full games. So I'm going to go for Simone Gordon. Go Simone Gordon. And I think for me, that's how I look at it from a coach's point of view. But then sometimes I do look at it from a fan point of view, and I'm like, yeah, you should have left Amelia Hall on, she would have gone in there, she'd have shot the shots. But then when I reflect back and I look from emotion, and I think these are the things that, as coaches, and I look at it from a coach's point of view, we need to be trained. And, I see some coaches out there and they get emotional and they're getting embroiled in everything that's off the court. And I'm thinking, that doesn't end well.
I love that, what you just said about Marion Lofthouse. The one game, you're going to love this story, Tracey. The game where it all made sense to me, and it was, again, before you had all the live stats on the bench and stuff. And also, too many stats can be a problem. But we were playing you in that grand final when Helen Housby scored the winning goal in 2014. So, sorry, Storm, up against Manchester Thunder. And to be fair, we were pretty evenly matched. I'm not sure anyone thought who was going to win. It was two great teams in that final. And you had Christine Enziano. I'm going to get her name wrong now. Who's the shooter?
Enziano. Yeah.
Enziano, right, yeah. It's a long time ago. She was your shooter and Helen Housby was your goal attack. And I had Hannah Knights at goalkeeper and Katie Holland, who was very young at that time, up against Helen Housby. Now, Helen Housby scored the winning goal. You won. It was in the dying seconds, I thought we were going to win. We had a centre pass. We lobbed it off the sideline. We went down the other end. You scored. End of story. When I reflected back on that game and got the stats through, Helen was the dominant shooter at goal attack. And because I was playing, I was caught up in the emotion. I was a player coach. So I was like, we just got to do this, we've got to do that. And it was goal for goal game the whole way through. And I think we got a small lead going into that last quarter. So I was quite confident. If I'd have had those stats in hindsight, I'd have flipped Hannah Knights onto Helen Housby. And I'd have done that to get my experience on the player that was winning that game. And it was a massive, massive eye-open for me that even though I was in that game and I was playing, I hadn't recognised that. And that was costly for us. And it was the biggest thing where I sat there and thought, geez, it's not just the obvious. It's like the stuff, and no one really noticed it. But it was the first time, really, shooters were sharing the load. And suddenly this kid had been scoring loads of goals. And I remember sitting there going, never again. And, and I preempt stuff. I look at things now and I try. It doesn't always mean you can fix it. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but your players have got to go out and perform. You've got to do the right tactics and you've got to technically teach them. But it did make me think, this is how you have to look at the game differently.
And Tamsin, there are like the good days when, the pressure, I look at, we played the final when Eleanor Cardle put them on at goalkeeper against Rachel Dunn, and she was just like Sophie Egg-Berron. We talked about her, in that game. We put Jodie Gibson on at goal defence because, when you're in a rational, non-emotional state, you're like, what does this game actually need? And you can actually see it from a coach's point of view. And I think sometimes we don't do that. And through this podcast, we've talked about pre-planned changes, getting players on the court, like the 2-point time, we making this, and sometimes we make these pre-planned things where actually sometimes we don't go back to our roots going, well, what does this actually need?
The international stage, so all the leagues are now kicking off. It's all happening all around the world. None of us have enough time ever in our diaries to watch all of them, but we're trying desperately. And it just got me thinking, because Australia used to be the big threat in terms of players wanting to go to SSN. It's still the dream. I still think there's the idea of living in Australia, all those kind of things. It makes sense. But I feel like we're being peppered everywhere now. I think ANZ has always been there, but I think that's going to grow because there's going to be more spaces. And then the other thing is the new Malaysian league as well, where there's clearly money being pushed around. It's clearly exciting. It's another opportunity to live in a country that you perhaps wouldn't have that opportunity to do. We've seen Ziggy Berger go there, Gretel Boetta and Laura Langman. Is it becoming a problem? Do we have to start looking at like where all these threats are coming from?
At the moment, I don't think so. If you look at the SSN in Australia, they are currently pipping the post in respect to access of players. But why do we look at it negatively, Tamsin? Because we're talking about development of players, developing experience, exposure. Currently, I see at the moment the one in Malaysia is great for Asian netball. Like if you think about more continents getting involved in netball and more exposure, and I think it's brilliant. And to have two big names like Langman and Boetta going there, and obviously Ziggy Berger is huge. But let's be realistic here. These are at the moment currently retired players, so we've actually not got anyone there going currently that is sort of a threat. But however, is it not about playing more netball? We're saying about more netball, more exposure, more development of players, more experience for players. Why are we trying to stop this? And we can't forget that South Africa have a great league that generally, I don't know if that still runs, that they go back to at the end of the year, generally to play in that. And, it's about more games, more exposure. And I don't see a negative in that. I think there can be a little bit more done by World Netball, and that's not in a negative sense. I think there needs to be something sat down to look at, what does this actually look like? I personally, for me, it isn't the leagues that are setting up. It's more the format of the international calendar. More exposure to an international calendar, more teams being able to be exposed, the financial restraints on some of the teams being able to put out consistent international calendars, and it's not just like the top 3 or 4 countries, but also for us to have maybe a world league. Like you're seeing the Lionesses at the moment playing like World Cup qualifiers, and you're seeing football teams that I generally don't get exposed to, and I think that's great. So, if we want more exposure, why can't we go down a little bit of that format? And I don't know what that looks like because you've just asked me on the pod, but I think that would be a real positive for international netball more than the threat of the leagues being set up.
So there's a couple of things from me there. Like the international window, I think is the key to all of this, because Commonwealth Games you can't get around. That's always going to be set. We're going to do the World Cup every 2 years, which is massive, and it's great for teams in terms of exposure. Like I talked about it when I was Scotland coach. Like you don't get opportunities to get better. Like it's really, really difficult. You don't have the financial. In Scotland we struggled because we, even getting the venues, so lastminute.com, and also like trying to piggyback off the back of test series. Sometimes England, you wouldn't know who they were playing. And I understand all the legal implications of why they needed to keep it quiet, but it wasn't always helpful for the home nations, because actually there was opportunity to piggyback off the back of things. But also then there's the element of that being difficult as well. So like when Uganda came over that time, I don't know if you remember, they came over and they only have a squad of 9 and they were playing 2 tests against Wales before they ended up going into the England. So there's also like a protection of teams as well about how you can help nations get ranking points and play against the top nations, and it also be beneficial, but also how you protect teams and making sure that, all the countries that don't necessarily have the same kind of level of support or financial backing as some of like the top 3 or 4. How does that work? It's a minefield. First question I want to ask, because one of the big plans around England getting closer to the top 3 was about us exposing them more, getting more game time against Australia and New Zealand, because they were across the sea from each other. They played each other loads. It was always them in finals. And that was a big thing when I was playing. We're going to play them more. We're going to go on tours there. They're going to come to us. We're going to get them. How much of a shift do you think has been where it's level pegging in terms of when that calendar's designed? Or is it still kind of, Australia lead the way? And, how hard is it to actually get those competitions in place?
I think Netball Australia they don't tend to have the same financial backing. So if you look at their international calendar this year, we haven't played them this year. When we come in, when I come into the England Netball Post, the two things to me was obviously we've got to be doing what the best team are doing, and they were full-time athletes at the time, or near enough full-time athletes. So that's why the centralised contract come in place. The next thing was we have to consistently be playing against the best in the league. So we come up with the quad series, and it obviously changed names, but it was regular. And I actually loved that now. But again, it's still admitted some of the key teams who couldn't afford to be in it. So you obviously have South Africa, New Zealand and us in that league. But then teams like Jamaica, Uganda, Malawi, but them teams were also able to play against Wales and Scotland while they were in our country, because they come to us generally in January, and we worked it around sort of the leagues and around the competitions. We've gone away from that now. Now what you've got in a situation where is every year the CEOs, PDs, chairs, whoever's doing it, are trying to fight for an international window to play against each other. Whereas World Netball potentially could step in on here and go, you have to play. And I don't know if it's a qualifier. I don't know if it's a stipulation. And I know there's finance, and we talk about a wish list here, don't we? But the wish list is that, will we see more teams if they're exposed? Would they be able to get better? Will they generate more income? I don't know, but there needs to be something done. And there needs to be a situation where teams can't refuse to play against another team as well. Because I'm not naive to think that sometimes that might happen, just, that does happen. New Zealand, if you look at New Zealand now, I don't know what their broadcast deal demands or where they're going, probably something we should have asked Cruz last week. But I think they had they had to play something like 15 to 19 international games for their broadcast deal. Now with England, that's not the case. There was never any stipulation on how many they had to play from the broadcast deal. With Australia, there isn't a stipulation with them either. So I don't know where it's going for me, because there needs to be something from World Netball personally. That's probably my final statement on it, really.
Well, it's messy, isn't it? Because exactly that, like, you force teams to play each other. And we discussed this when we were in Scotland. It's like,
Yeah.
They have to be made to play right. But then there's the financial implication. It's how the cost of that, the travel. You put a test series in, and this is no dig, but when Jamaica played England in the Horizon series and they didn't have their starting lineup, it was there much learned from that? Do you know what I mean? Like that, you have to be also mindful that you want to put on great events and you want the best players playing in there. And I understand why Jamaica players weren't all available, but for that, again, what's the purpose then of those series? And it's the same with the fluctuation of like the squads, who's in them, who's available, how do you use this as a building, where are they going to be played, that the fans get to access to see as well, how easy is it to do tours to other parts of the world? There's so much more than there's visa issues. There's so much going on from organisations that there does have to be a little bit more buy-in from everybody, and led, I think, from the top. Because like you say, at the moment, because there's so many things that you're all battling with, you end up just certain teams getting getting more out of it than others. And we're still in that stage where actually you only have to see the exposure Uganda, Malawi, South Africa and England have all had, and Jamaica against Australia and New Zealand, to see the impact that's had on the world game. And we want that. We want the game to grow. I want England to win, but it'd be nice to win 1 out of knowing 10 teams could win, rather than it just being 1 out of 3, 4, 5, depending on the squads at that time.
But Tamsin doesn't need to be more accountability around it. So, I look at other sports and I look at, say, rugby, cricket, football. Like, they would never, ever go into a competition without generally their full team or without as many players available. And, you can't determine injuries and stuff like that. But if it's a friendly, it's identified as a friendly. It's said this is a friendly, but they put a lot more accountability. So like World Cup, to go to World Cup, you have to qualify through these particular avenues. So there's more accountability around it. Maybe we need to have from World Netball more accountability competitions. So there's absolutely no excuse, because what's happening is people are just waiting. And I know there's a finance problem on this. I know there's a finance problem. But if we want a consistent international calendar, we want a lot more teams exposed, we want to play against a lot more, the accountability will be they have to play them games to get to a certain point. And the biggest competition that everyone wants to get to is the World Cup. So the 2-year leading in, people probably should be accountable to playing against certain teams. Now, I don't know how that's going to be run. I don't know if it's run as a qualifier to lead in, so it actually builds up to World Cup. But just think about the commercial selling point around that. Now, it's going to take a lot to get going, but the commercial selling point around that you actually have, you generating fan base over a 2-year period to get to that World Cup. So, I'm following, obviously the football at the moment, and I'm like, whoa, Spain played last night and, they were mega, and England took, pipped them at the post to get top of the table. And I'm like, wow, like what's that going to look like, when they get to World Cup? What's that going to look for the groups? And I think to myself, would that, now I know we've not got as many teams playing or that go to a World Cup as probably football at the moment, but we're still in a position where, do we need to make them more accountable? Because then you have to turn up.
Well, it's really funny, right? So this is my big dreamer world, because this is what I spend most of my life doing. So I would love to see the 4 leagues, your South Africa and England, New Zealand and Australia, align in terms of England and South Africa play at the same time, New Zealand and Australia play at the same time, right? And they're back to back. So actually, for a player, because there's so much to this, and it depends where you are in your career and what you're doing or whatever. But imagine, like, our league is only 3 or 4 months. Australia's the same, because you've only got 8 teams in there. And we're going to talk about why it's hard to expand in a second because of the financial. But imagine you had South Africa and Australia and England playing at the same time, and New Zealand and Australia, and you could double up. So as a player, you could play for 6 months. You could absolutely do that. As a player, I'd have loved that. Geez, if I could have played my season out in Netball Super League in my mid-20s to early 30s and then go out and play in Australia, God, I would have done that. And then you have a window of time of internationals where teams have to play each other so many times, and there's so many different rankings and whatever. That would be ideal, right? Because then for 9 months of the year, you would have actively seasons. And for an older player, you might go, I only want to play in Australia, and then I want to play at the Commonwealth Games, and then I want to have a 6-month break. But actually, for some of these other players, you could play 9 months of the year and then have, imagine this, 3 months off. 3 months of no netball and no camps and no like things. And actually the idea of then this whole like following the sport would be so much easier, because that's a huge thing. Like, one of the big problems for broadcast is that and it's a bit of a generalization, but one of the big things around netball and the chat around sponsorship and broadcast is a lot of the time we only have 3 or 4 months of the year, so there's a huge drop off. And I used to talk to people all the time about this, like, what can we keep interesting? Like, how do we make the transfer window better? Like, how do we keep people talking about the sport? All those things, when we play abroad, having games on at 2 or 3 in the morning is no good. Like, how do we make that better so we can watch worldwide? So I think that there's loads of things. And in my ideal world, like, if everybody did that together and we had this 9-month year and then a break, players would feel healthier, coaches would feel healthier, the fan base would actually grow, I think. And you'd have these mega things going on. Imagine London Mavericks and Melbourne Mavericks being like a feeder team, like a team where you could cross over. I mean, we've got the colours, we've got the branding, that could absolutely work. Like,
well, Richo wants your
I hear
hat,
Rico
by
wants
the
my
way.
cap. She wants my cap. I don't know, and
It
I'm
looks
just
like
saying,
other coaches
I've
do as well,
heard,
Tamsin.
it's a very popular thing. I don't want to say I'm a trendsetter, but it is what it is. But like I know I live in like La La Land half the time, but there is a place I think where all nations could work together because we're all suffering the same issue. The big thing is sponsorship and financial, and that's the only way all of us across the world are going to survive.
Yeah, I sort of agree. I just look at when Gary
You
and
don't have
Phil
to
were playing
agree.
football, and I
You
sort of
don't
look at where.
usually.
Yeah, no, I do think we need to look at. We do need to do something. Because I feel, with AFLW, with women's football coming bigger now, we need to start striving, for a new strategy, and that isn't just one country. That's the whole of the governance. All the way around the world. Like, what's our next move? I look at Gary and Phil, and it makes me laugh. We do have the longest preseason ever in netball. Like, people don't believe it, but we have the longest preseason ever. But in football, they only have 3 weeks off. So, and people always go, oh, it's money, it's money, it's money. Like, there's leagues playing all the way down to the division who are not earning as much money as some of the netballers. In football, like, you go into semi-professional and there's still, that they don't get as much off as netball. And, they got 3 weeks off. 1 week was complete rest, and then 2 weeks was active rest, and then they were back in. They got 3 weeks to go on holiday. But it keeps it sweet, and they have international breaks between the seasons. Now, whether you could go, the surface is a massive problem in netball, but also we look at all the injuries and, the absolute, deload, loading, deload, loading. I feel like it's a constant rather than keeping athletes at a quite consistent level. I think that's a huge problem in netball, and that's why we're getting a lot of the injuries, because there's no seamlessness between things. So if you
Well,
look
the
at the
load
moment, Tamsin,
raises as well from Super League to international, so we
and-
know that.
and what happens is they go on international duty, they go back to Super League, and what they do. We used to have a coach, and I'm not going to name who that coach is, when I was an England player.
It's not like
So
you.
we used to release the players on a Thursday to go back to Thursday night training. And then what they would do then is they go back to the Thursday Super League training. They'd have them Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then they'd come back into us on a Monday. We used to have a Super League coach who thought, right, what I'll do is I'll train them now Thursday, Saturday, and sometimes she'd put in on a Sunday because she felt more exposure. What she did is that was her need, not the player's need. And I feel sometimes what happens is because you don't see them, you rag them, and then they come back into Super League, they get ragged. And you're seeing it now, like, you look at 6 weeks out from the start of the season, 8 weeks out, all the injuries are starting to happen. Well, that's typical. That's always typical. We've raised the bar on an athlete to such a load. We've not deloaded them properly. Then we sort of load them again properly, and then suddenly they get injuries. And, I think there needs to be something better that happens, and potentially consistency of competition. Playing athletes, do I think they can play all year round? The surface is a massive issue because obviously, it's a hard surface. But I do think there can be a little bit more smartness around what we're doing around the world. But a lot of that's down to broadcasts as well, Tamsin.
I think there's so much in it, isn't it? And the financial implications, and like what you're talking about there is squad sizes would need to be bigger. I was actually a huge advocate for 10, but for lots of reasons, not just from a performance point of view in terms of how little you play your 11th and 12th player and how many of the big teams hoarded players, because I think you've got a better split now, and we've chatted about even in the squads of 10 how you're struggling to get equal court time for even all your key players. So that there's that element, but the other part is the huge financial implication. So we have a salary cap in the Super League, and so you have to pay a minimum amount of play for players. And I know you're not just talking then adding 2 players, the cost of just paying them, the cost of insurance, the cost of travel, the cost of all the added extras, the MRIs, all the things that come out of it, the kit. Like there's so much more to it than just that, and it's a huge cost on clubs to be able to do that. And one of the professionalisation eras was like, can clubs account for that cost? I think you actually had some sums from SSN, didn't you?
Yeah, we like just going on that. The reason that people want the 11th and 12th players if they get an injury, like because they can't
They're not
currently
using
play
them
the 10
until.
players they're
Yeah.
playing. Yeah, so they're not using them until. So the 11th to 12th is so again, it's what does the game need? Now the game needs that if 11th and 12th play, what you've got now is, and you've seen some injuries out at SSN now, you've seen some in NSL. You haven't got the pick of the land now because we've got so many professional leagues happening. So you can't just go, oh, I'm just going to take, Adio out of Pulse and take her over to Australia, which you used to be able to do. You can't do that now because we're all on professional contracts. But so in Australia they brought in the 11th player, and I do like the 11th player. We've talked a lot, like even Sophia Berrin now. You'd make her an 11th player, wouldn't you? 100% you'd make her an 11th player. Millie Carter, there's a lot of players.
Well,
now
I'd have
that
done the
you'd make
same with
11th
Hannah Nightbridge when Ellie Ratty's back. I'd want her as my 11th player.
But
why
there is a
wouldn't you?
cost implication of doing that. Now, we talked about in the SSN about why can't we travel with our 11th player? Now, some teams did. Some teams travelled with their 11th player. Some teams didn't, and you looked at Ariang at West Coast Fever, had a serious injury. Now, we actually worked out the cost to travel with one of the teams worked out the cost of travelling with our 11th player, or the cost implication of it. I think it was something like $165,000. I'm just going to pull that out.
Yeah, by the time you've added everything up.
That's huge. Like when you think about kit and you talked about all the things you talked about, that is huge on a franchise. That's a huge on cost for a franchise. So that actually, we were like, absolutely not. Like we don't want that. We don't need that on cost. We've got enough on cost as it is. When you're traveling with a player who statistically, it only plays something like 2% of the season. That's statistically. Now you can talk probably different players. And there's probably exceptional circumstances when you have. But your training environment still stays the same, because I look at Melbourne Mavericks, we get in men, we get in some of our SSM, we used to get in our SM reserves, so your training environment's not changed. You just prioritise your 10. So I don't think there's an increased load on the 10 players. It's just the fact that you can't carry any 2 more good players. That's what it is.
Yeah. My team laugh at me because I go, you always have a habit. Like I listened to my pod the other week and I was like, I've got to stop saying interesting, I'm annoying myself. So you always have a habit of how you do things. I remember when I first started commentating, and my producer, Helen, she's brilliant. She was like, you say look all the time before you start a sentence. And I'm like, don't say look, don't say look, don't say look. But my team always laugh at me because I always end each little meeting going, right, today's going to be short and sharp, and I see them all sniggering. I'm like, well, what do you want me to say? It's going to be long-winded. And actually our sessions have become like an hour on court because I only have the 10. I have obviously other people in. I don't need to get through so many combinations. So actually it's, I don't flog them for the full 2 hours. We're literally only on court for that amount of time. And to be honest, my pre-seasons will get shorter the longer I've had the group together, and the technically better they get as well, because that's the other issue. You can bring in a squad in SSN in 6 weeks before. You can bring in your international squad in 1 week before, because you don't need to teach them some of the other things, some of the basics, some of the unforced stuff, because they don't do it. They just don't do it. But until they've been through that process, so how you work them through the pathway, how you develop, and also the annoying thing is at the minute, Helen Housby is irreplaceable, right? So her getting injured is so costly because she's Helen Housby. But Helen Housby back in your Manchester Thunder team, it would have been a pain, but you'd have still had someone there. And so this is the nature as well of there will be an aging squad. When for Australia, when Sophie Garbin decides to retire, who is their next shooter? And we don't know that yet. But they don't need to worry about that because Sophie Garbin's there. But, they will have to look at that. But there's a period of time where you're like, well, you just kind of ride it out because that's what we've got. And so I think it becomes quite interesting, doesn't it? That I've said it again, interesting. But
I said for me. Mine's for me. I actually said I'd donate £1 to charity when I keep saying for me.
It's all right. Guys, listen at home. We know how annoying we are. We're very sorry, but we rub it on. But yeah, it's it's a big topic. It's not as easy as, again, everybody thinks. And I think that is the joy of doing this podcast. We just want to bring more things to attention, that it's not always just what you want. So the expansion of teams, absolutely brilliant. The cost implications for everybody else, massive, especially in the SSN. That's two more travel trips every year that cost you a lot of money because you're not on the doorstep there. You can't get a bus at 7 o'clock in the morning and arrive in Newcastle at whatever time. You're flying. So there's so much more to it than just what you see on the ground. And although we want the game to grow, I think there's a bigger way of doing it about how what we've got at the minute is very good. How now do we make it easier for consumption? How can you watch more games? Having 4 games on a Saturday, not ideal, people. Even the netball brains here, me and Tracey don't get to sit down, the luxury with the young kids and watch 4 netball games back to back. How do you spread that out? How do you make it better for the internationals? How do you get teams better? How do you bring in young players? How do you stem injuries? So many talking points, no clear answers. But I think, Tracey, we're in the healthiest place netball has been. It's now about how we condense that and step up. You agree?
Yeah, netball is in that point where we either need to push it on, and there needs to be some massive, risky, big decisions made by the powers that be, or it's going to deteriorate because a lot more is happening around. I'm sat in the football world now, and it's so exciting. Some of the things that they're doing in women's football, and I'm not talking, Tamsin, like, we talk a lot about NSL, and I can sit here and go, these are the changes I would make at England netball now, and these come through my mind all the time. I don't know what's wrong with my mind. It's a bit like yours, I think. This is what I dream about, and I sit there going, when I see with football, they're not just addressing what's at the top. They're coming down to me at tier 4, and tier 3, tier 3. So you look at that, that's the 4th division. So, there can't just be changes. There has to be changes around the regional competitions, the county competitions, the Premier League. There has to be wholesale changes. And do you know what? I look at when I was in Australia, and I learned a lot about their development and their leagues, and it feels like they're seamless. And I don't feel that in the UK. I don't feel that our leagues are seamless. And there's different ways you can do that. And I think football's in the same situation. It's very seamless. It goes from top to bottom, or it goes from bottom to top. Whereas, I look at my niece, what she's doing. She's playing all over the show. Where it just doesn't happen like that in Australia. And I think there has to be a wholesale change down the absolute whole system. And I do have some good ideas, Tamsin, but I don't think it's for today.
No, don't just drop a bomb and leave us there, Tracey, because you know what will happen. Get rid of Prem. No, don't do that. That'll upset all the listeners. I'm just kidding. Look, here's the thing. We've got to be creative. You've got to move with the times. You've got to keep changing. If you stay in one position, I've always been an advocate for this, and I know it gets me a lot of grief sometimes, but I want to be brave. I want to be ballsy. I want to put it out there. I want the game to keep moving. I want us to absolutely thrive. And like you say, for that to happen, sometimes you've got to rip the Band-Aid off and you've got to do something that's brave. I'm sure we will talk more about that in future episode, but that is our hour up, Tracey Neville. We are not allowed to talk any longer. You can carry on enjoying your international break. I'm going to go and work out how we score more 1 points this week. And on that note, we will leave you with the round 8 roundup. Starting on Friday the 17th, we have 6:55 game Birmingham Panthers versus Nottingham Forest. You can find that on Sky Sports Mix, Sky Sports YouTube, and on Sky Sports Plus. On Saturday the 18th, there's 2 games for you. 3:55 AO Manchester Thunder versus Leicester Nets Dragons. That is on Sky Sports YouTube, Sky Sports Plus, and the app. The BBC game is at 6 o'clock. That is Loughborough Lightning versus my team, London Mavericks. And then to round you up on Sunday the 19th on Sky, 5:55, you'll find London Pulse versus NIC Leeds Rhinos. That's on Sky Sports YouTube, Sky Sports Plus, and the app.